correct. They were not talking about more than 50, not talking about more than 50,000, but more than 500,000 photos. Yeah, 567,000 approximately to our last calculation. So I'll just begin with sharing the presentation. And first of all, I want to say thank you for attending. And for those of you, some of you already know, I'm colleagues, so great to see you. And for those who are new, I'm happy to meet you. And let me just begin immediately with the presentation. And I want to present in the next hour and 15 minutes, because I want to leave some time for questions at the end. To raise not just questions, but also not just ideas, but also kind of issues and dilemmas we find ourselves in our archives in Yad Vashem, and it's also transferred to my current position, which is involved in online content, because there's an interlinkage today between presentation, cataloging, and how it's presented online. So for me, the movement from the photo collection from the archive to the digital sphere is kind of a development of what I was doing in the last stage of my in Yad Vashem. And it brings a lot of challenges also on how do you present ethical questions of how do you present Holocaust-related material, which I would also like to raise in the next hour. So I'm going to divide this lecture into 3 parts. One of it is, the first is kind of presentation of what Yad Vashem photo and film collection consists of. And then part of the challenges and the way we dealt with them, and perhaps we could have done a few things differently. And then at the end, questions of the future. How does the future of Holocaust, and especially visual related material, is going to work? And I begin with this with the short story of our collections and how they developed, because one thing we need to remember about Yad Vashem as a collection, which is similar to many of the collections here, but not all of them, is that we're not a statutory organization. That means we can't compare us to an organizational archive, such as, let's say, the national archives or state archives or city archives, where there's a certain mandatory, somebody's legally obliged to transfer the information to the archives. The only archives which is organic to Yad Vashem itself are the institutional archives of Yad Vashem. That means we also have one collection of a few thousand photos, today most of them digital, of events of Yad Vashem, state visits, or development, for example, of building new monuments or the opening of the museum. So we have an archive of Yad Vashem, which is one collection among our 17,000 collections, but a big one. But the rest is material that we actually gained throughout history. And the picture you see in front of you appears in a copy from collection. And we're going to talk about the question of what does a copy mean. I have a few examples later on of the discovery of the Ringelblum archives, at least with the shelter in 1946. And part of the collectors of the Ringelblum collection, and during the Holocaust, Rachel Auerbach became the second head of the archives. The first head of Yad Vashem archives, before it was actually a national institution, when it was still kind of a small office in Jerusalem. Sarah Friedlander was herself an archivist in Hungary. She unfortunately died in battle in 1948 in the war, during the battles of Jerusalem in 1948. And Rachel Auerbach, who began her collections in Yad Vashem back in 1948, she began head of the archives until the 60s. She's the one who established also the Yad Vashem archives. And it's interesting to see, we found her documentation where she writes about her tasks in Yad Vashem, guidelines in 1956 on how to take evidence, to gather evidence, in the sense of how do you take an oral evidence. And she begins with that. She's just continuing her job from the ghetto now in Jerusalem, where she started collecting evidence from oral history from refugees who were sent to the Warsaw Ghetto. And now she's just introducing her guidelines on how to interview people. Very interestingly, just a small anecdote, we in Yad Vashem wrote the guidelines of collecting oral history also recently in events of the last 6 months, and we used her guidelines as a basis to write the updated guidelines of collecting historic oral history. So interesting how she continues, how the story kind of continues till this day. And when we reach Yad Vashem in the early stages, I have an interesting film that we found in our film collection on a reel. You can see Yad Vashem back in 1955, before it reached the mountain where we're now. And you can see the early collection of material at Yad Vashem. And notice we're still in some offices, in this case in Ben Yehuda 7th Street in Jerusalem. you can see Yochel Auerbach in the background and Shinhavi. And here you can see what, if you know what Yad Vashem, the Hall of Names is, this is the early stage of the collection. And here you can see also the first photos. So when we say we have 560,000 photos in Yad Vashem, almost 570,000, then the 150,000 of them are connected to the pages of testimony, which are documents that were the Holocaust survivors recorded, people they knew. And this is the old Hall of Names. So when you reach the museum and you see the new, the structure from 2005, or with this very beautiful architecture, it began here in the pictures we see over here before it was transferred to our new collection. So as mentioned, these pages of testimony being our first visual collection, but you can see that it first and foremost focuses on the people themselves. I just randomly took 2 pages where there are photos of 2 Jews from Thessaloniki who were murdered in Auschwitz. And you can see that the report, Sam Samuelidis from Athens, after the war, talks and reports his wife and daughter, I'm sorry, Emmanuel, his son, Joshua Emanuel, who were killed in Auschwitz. So these are the first pages of testimony. But I have to say, we have 150,000 of these pages of testimony with images. We have all in all today collected 4.9 million names of victims. So imagine that 4.7 of them, 4.5 of them don't have an image, a million of them. So that's part of the, it just shows you, even though we have quite many pictures, we don't actually have this, it doesn't represent the majority of the victims. Here's one example I just happened to find in our collection. It's a report of a girl called Reich. It's written by victim's family, Reich name, no first name, approximate age of death, half an hour. Victim's family status, daughter, taken away from her mother in Auschwitz on the 11th of September 44. And the connection to the victim, it says here, mother. So this is a report from an Australian lady who came here in 2007 and reported the death of a half-year-old daughter. Naturally, there's no picture, but here we don't even have a first name because there was not enough time to give the child a name. So in 1955, the Yad Vashem archives are officially opened here in the mountain of Yad Vashem, but the way it was collected is that you have different sources. So the first photos we have in our collections are the first collection, which I mentioned earlier on, which are the pages of testimony. But already in the DP camps, for example, and in Poland, there were attempts to archive history and create, especially visual history, photos. I think the iconic photos from the Holocaust are preserved back in 1946 during the Nuremberg trial. So for example, we have a whole collection of albums from 1946 that were created in the DP camps. And these are the first albums in the Yad Vashem collection. They were created by historical committees, and they travel to Jerusalem, to Israel. And then the question is, where did they go to Yad Vashem or not? As I said, we were never a statutory archive. There is no legal obligation in Israel, neither in the rest of the world, to provide Yad Vashem with Holocaust-related material. We have to fight for it. And we say when we have to fight for it, it's because we have competition. I'm not talking about USHMM. I'm talking in Israel. The Ghetto Fighters House have a very substantial archive, a very good archive, very good archivists, a lot of history behind them. So you actually have to have this competition of who gains that material. So what we have is what we were able to gain. And then some of the material is in collections. I'll soon explain what the collection means. Some of them in our albums. An album may be part of a collection. It may be a collection for itself. I will talk about it. I won't confuse you too much just in the area item. But the big problem is, and this was a big challenge when I entered Yad Vashem and the archives a few years back, is we get 10,000 new photos each and every year. And one of the first challenges is how do you prioritize? Do you prioritize what's coming in, i.e. LIFO, last in, first out? Or do you work on what you have already for years, but you haven't cataloged yet? FILO, first in, last out. By the way, we began with LIFO and then we changed it in the middle, and I'll soon explain why. We had something, an event that changed the whole situation of the archives, which is the movement to a new archival building, and that created new thinking of how we archive and also presented some of the problems we have. The material we have is not just limited to the events of the Holocaust, since from the beginning we're collecting images of the victims. So we're looking for as many images as possible of the victims, which includes material of pre-war Jewish life. And here, challenge. How do we limit it? How do we prevent, how do we have, for example, many people in Israel, expect that if their family comes from the Holocaust or lived in Europe before the war, then the Yad Vashem would be interested in the whole family material. And we have to explain to them that actually we're interested in material from, let's say, 1930 onwards. We can't be a place where you dump just photos from the past. And there are also other institutions in Israel that deal with the Jewish communities before the war. For example, Ani Museum, the museum in Tel Aviv University of the Jewish world, and they have their archive of the Jewish people. So they have a lot of interesting material also to collect. So we need to kind of see what goes to them, what goes to us, or at least help the people decide what's the better location for the collections. Naturally, we want to provide evidence of the Holocaust because this is what the people back in 1946 were aiming to do. And you can see that in the early stages of our collection, I would say up to 1965, 68, the vast majority of the material we get are macabre, very graphic images of the Holocaust, as if in the early 20 years, the main obligation of this archive in the sense of what people collected here was evidence of the Holocaust. And it's only later that people realized that perhaps we need to broaden the horizon of our collection. And then you have naturally the fact that when you get material immediately after, it's usually in better condition. And the earlier it is in the archive, the better it is for the material. But that's not the case. Today, we're still getting material, and then some of the material is in difficult condition. And then the last question is, how do you categorize this material, digitalize and make it accessible for the public? And then you have some ethical and moral questions you have to counter, questions that perhaps 50 years ago, for digitalized collections, you may not have had. Most of our collections come from various sources. So number one is, for example, I mentioned the historical collections. Rachel Auerbach came from Poland back in the late 40s, and she had in her suitcases material, which we have until today in our collection. The same applies to other Holocaust survivors. Some of them bring private items, some of them find material. We have, for example, the whole registry of Mauthausen concentration camp in our collection was just taken by a soldier of the Allied forces who thought it's a good idea to take it from Mauthausen Kommandatur and then deliver it to Yad Vashem in the 70s, and just came into the office say, hey, I have it, by the way, it might interest you. I don't have place, I'm retiring now. A British soldier. And it may be material that is reliquium, reliquia. For example, in our mountain, we have ashes that was bought from Poland. However, from the early decision, I'll do it this way. Accessions is material that we get and that we buy, or we don't buy material because we don't want to promote Holocaust, or we have a policy that we don't buy Yad Vashem material from other collectors. We don't have a problem if someone brought it in certain auction and we can ensure that it's authentic, but we don't want to promote Holocaust marketing, eBay, memorabilia sale, and so on. So we don't do it ourselves. Individual donations, and I'll soon talk about this specifically because here we have some of the biggest challenges. In fact, the collections almost grew by 33% in the last 10 years just because our attempt to collect from individuals in Israel, and acquisitions from other archives. This is not something that is common to many archives, but many archives have share material with different archives, but it was already in the 50s. This concept that the researcher, especially if he lives in Israel, may not have access to archives in the world. And Yad Vashem has to provide this material for him or her, or if it's to do with genealogy. So a lot of our material was bought by Yad Vashem, but from an archive. Usually a copy was given to us. In photos, either if the original archives has a negative, then they were redeveloped for the collections of Yad Vashem, or we were just given a digitalized copy in later stages, for example. This material is very valuable because it allows researchers. Now, in the 1950s, when Rachel Auerbach wrote her guidelines for collecting oral history, she asked herself in that book, which we have in our collections, why is it important 11 years to gather testimony after the Holocaust? And she says, they're beginning to forget things anyway. we're dealing with this story today, 80 years after. To think about it, that she's talking about 11 years after. And the answer is she still finds value both in historical, moral, social, and judicial value, which is today something we very seldom talk about our collections, but our collections also has a judicial meaning. They prove certain crimes. So when the Eichmann trial began in 1960 in Israel, then a lot of the material came from the collections from Yad Vashem, from the Ghetto Fighters House, which already kept the evidence in many stages. And I'll give you a few examples. So the investigation files are a collection of documents that were brought by survivors. Usually they had connections to investigation committees created after the war, and they do their own research. Some of it is research that was done for institutional way, but they were able to bring the information with them. Acquisitions, this is, for example, from the Bundesarchiv. Now, I think from Bundesarchiv, if I'm not mistaken. Bundesarchiv is a very important archive for us because it provides a lot of perpetrator material. However, the Bundesarchiv is not the only one. We try now more and more to work with smaller archives. For example, we made a lot of work, our acquisition team made a lot of work in Ukraine, for example, before the war broke out, going through provincial archives and small town archives. Maybe they have information that can tell us more about the communities, and then we try to bring them here. This is, for example, from a session we got in 1995. Until up to 1995, there was in the Israel police certain section dealing with investigations of the crimes of the Nazis. Up to now, it's the only law in Israel that can deliver a death sentence in Israel. It's laws of justice with Nazis and collaborators. But the fact that in 1995, that department closed means that the law became practically obsolete. And they just donated all the collections, all the files. So some of this material is itself a copy from materials in German archives that were given to the Israeli police at the time, but then indirectly came to us. So this is a decision from the Israeli police to donate to Yad Vashem this material. And this is what we have from recent years, which possesses one of the biggest challenges we have today in our archives. When I came to the archives, one of the problems was that it became almost impossible to catalog each and every photo. And there was a decision to stop doing it, and it was reversed 2 years ago. The decision before I came. The reason was, in 2011, Yad Vashem said, okay, Holocaust survivors are getting quite old. Most of them live in nursery homes, or in general are incapable of coming to Yad Vashem. In the past, Yad Vashem was kind of more passive in the sense that unless it was a real important collection that we want to get our hands on, most of it was time we're just sitting here and accepting material. And then 2011, somebody came and said, look, this generation won't come to us anymore. If we don't come to them and collect them, they may die, pass away from old age, and nobody will have that material anymore. The children may just throw it or keep it in the most terrible conditions. And they can see just an example of the conditions in this example. So we made an initiative called Gathering the Fragments in 2011, where we asked people, we went to community centers, we went to public libraries and asked them, do you have material that can benefit the collections, historical collections? Mainly, we expect it to be mostly pre-war Jewish life. However, we also expected it to last only a day. But on the first day, approximately 6,000 people appeared in our collection points. And then we realized that we're onto something. And the operation Gathering the Fragments is still on 13 years later. And as I said, it was something that the archive wasn't prepared for, getting 10,000 new photos each and every year on average. The photo archives, and then later on amalgamated with the film archives back in 2021, had only 4 staff members who now have to deal with 10,000 photos a year and occasionally also films appearing, and also has to deal with all the other tasks of investigation, preservation, and so on. So here's just an example of one family from Germany. And you can see the whole generational change of the Jewish community through that collection. And also the professions, so you learn quite a lot about it. And I think these are very interesting collections, but they're mainly private collections. Another interesting example of material we got, this is actually from Israel. It's quite surprising if you think the Gebirgsjägerregiment 98, and you see the swastika and Einmarsch in Österreich, the arrival in Austria. What is it? This material from Invasion. This is these are individual photos from this album. What is appearing in? Why is it appearing in Israel? Well, Werner Liesch was a quarter Jewish soldier that until 1941, quarter Jewish soldiers were still permitted to be in the Wehrmacht. And he participates in the invasion of Austria and Czechoslovakia. This is the in-between, and this is the invasion on the right to Czechoslovakia, to the Sudetenland, and in 38. And then he goes to pee off a mountain and trips and falls off the mountain and dies. So his friends from the unit made a farewell album to the comrade that has just died. It's before the war, so it's still something that doesn't happen quite often. And they show images from day-to-day life in the unit and some invasions to Austria and Czechoslovakia in between. Now, the brother, the mother is half Jewish. The brother is a quarter Jewish. He's also a second-grade Mischlinge. Decides after the war to emigrate to the future state of Israel, and he marries an Israeli woman. And he brings the album from Germany with him, and that remains within the Israeli family. So think about the complicated identity of the family. In 2012, they donate this album to Yad Vashem. And on one hand, this is perpetrator material, but it's also Jewish material at the same time. It's a very complicated categorization here. But it's, of course, it's valuable material that even if you don't see the Holocaust, you see a lot of what we call perpetrator material, which is valuable for the historical knowledge. So we have now a big mishmash, and we need to kind of find an order in the system. The one on the bottom right is acquired from the USHMM. It's from the album of the perpetrators in Auschwitz. But here we have material. This cabinet, is it doing here? I'll soon explain why. Also various conservation problems. And we have this photo here, which is what I say, a classic Holocaust image, however, not unique. This image alone in our collection, we have more than 15 times copies of this photo. Remember, a developed photo is usually not the original, and the original is somewhere negative that may never be found, or if it is found, then that there's no question where the original is. I usually argue that a photo in its original, a developed photo is only original when it's in context of the album, because then the album is the original format and not the individual photo itself. We still get, and I think this is from donations from abroad. This is still I would say the second most popular after private material kind of we get, which is images of corpses of liberation. I'll just split the pages because not everybody finds it convenient to look at corpses all the time. But once a week, we get a letter from an American family, not Jewish, sometimes Jewish, saying, look, we found my father was in liberation. We have these terrible images from the day of liberation. Occasionally, it's unique. That means we didn't see anything like that, specifically like that photo in the world. But it's usually not unique in context. It's just a collection of bodies. We think about American soldiers being they're overwhelmed by what they see, so they take the camera out. But in many cases, it's that specific photo. And they think what they have is, first of all, the original, which isn't. And then you have to explain to them that actually this isn't the original. And these kind of photos were spread out throughout the end of the war. So the question of originality becomes, which archive is original today? It's getting more and more easy because it's public domain in many cases. But again, these questions come up. Where does the original belong to? And also, we also get more and more ready. In the past, we didn't do it, but now we're more and more ready to tell people, thank you, but we actually don't need such a photo anymore. More atrocity photos now, so you can look away. Again, the topics of our interest. This is an acquisition which you probably won't be able to see online because it's from the Belarus State Archives. One of I think the best, when I see bodies, I just come back and forth all the time because I know some people find it difficult. But for example, we have an agreement with the Belarus State Archives, but with a condition that it won't be online. We're very happy because it's not that easy to have contact with Belarusian archives, but because we had the staff that was developed good connections there in 1995 and made a substantial acquisition from there. So this is material that is on our collection. For us, this is interesting material on the whole war in the East, which is, I think, the material which we have the biggest problem. Back to the terrible photos. Palina Gilman, the famous pilot, Jewish pilot of the Red Army, the ace of the Red Army. And then on the right, you have execution in Crete. Now that came to us, that's an acquisition from the Bundesarchiv. It came by mistake. at the time, people didn't really know to separate between crimes of Nazis directed against Jews and crime not directed at Jews. Today, probably wouldn't acquire that photo, but I'm still very happy that we have these pictures of Greek men brought to their execution, because it allows to put the Holocaust in context. We need to always find the balance. What is our thematic team? And we're Yad Vashem. We deal with the history of the murder of the Jews in Europe during World War II. But you still try to put some context to events, who were the Nazis and so on. But where's the limit? Because you can't have everything. Now, you ask yourself, why is a Grand Mufti of Jerusalem? Am I doing propaganda here? Well, the problem is that this is the first photo in Yad Vashem collection. It's from the 1946 albums. And the first photo in the first album is a Khanjar forces with Haj Amin al-Husseini. Why is it the first thing that they wanted to collect in our collections? I don't know. But it deals a lot of how perhaps in 1946 what was important for them. Then the question of time becomes more and more valuable, because these are the earliest photos we have in Yad Vashem. The story of this specific album, where we can see these photos, is back in the 60s. Somebody found in the remains of the Dachau camp, I think it was outside the Dachau camp itself, but it was belongings of people who were sent to Dachau. With it, 2,500 photos and another 900 photos in album format. Now, some of these albums are from the 19th century. They possess the oldest pictures we have in our collection. None of them show Holocaust, because it's people, when people were sent somewhere, they would take their family album, which is the most valuable thing for them at the moment. And then it remains. And you can really see the history of photography in these albums, because here we have two images from two different albums where you really see the scenery is the same. They're both on the beach. But here it's obviously a studio, and here it's obviously on the beach itself. And you can really see how the same image transfers from the studio to the outside world once photography goes outside, somewhere in the early 20s. On the other side is, where do we stop? These are images of the DP camps, of the camps that were created in Cyprus. This was actually quite a new accession we got. It was a gift we got last year from the Cypriot president, who, what the chairman of Yad Vashem said, probably one of the best gifts Yad Vashem ever got, a discom key with 300 photos in the best quality possible of Jews in the camps that the British created in Cyprus, of Jews who tried to reach here at the time in the 1947, 46, 47 were prevented. So for us, this is, of course, it's relevant. Even though it's post-war, it's Holocaust survivors on their escape. But what do we do with this material? It is part of our collection. Soldiers of Jewish soldiers of foreign arms. Well, both of these photos we got in our collection. On the one line, it's written here in Cyrillic script, Dunhua. Dunhua is in China. It's a Red Army soldier in the Far East. But it's very interesting to see this photo of the Red Army Jewish soldier in the Far East, because it comes in a collection which begins with the father of the family being a Russian prisoner of war in Austria during the First World War. Then the two children, one dying in Austria in the Second World War, and the other son in the Far East. So all this family history of soldiers in Russian army, in the Imperial Army, and then the Red Army, and Soviet Army, is encapsulated in this, and in two different fronts, encapsulated in this collection. So it tells you a lot about this Jewish story. Iudais Formes, who was a Holocaust survivor from Greece, from Thessaloniki here, is in his military uniform. And one thing when we notice in our collections is the problem with visual material, that it's not fair. If we have 3,500 film reels in our collection, of which 1,200, 1/3 are from the Netherlands, it's not fair. Why is the Netherlands so common in our material? First of all, because Dutch Jews were the wealthiest in Europe, so they had the capability of buying the material and the cameras and the reels in the 1920s and 30s. Second of all, perhaps the events of the Holocaust in the West were allowed during the War of the Preservation, which in the East, of course, in the sending to the ghettos and the burning of everything and the destruction of towns and villages, very little remained. When it comes to poor Jews from poorer countries, like in Greece, we found out that many of the people who were documented, for example, Esformes over here, Esformes, were printed in uniform, because when you are conscripted to military service, and you could join the army, they take a photo of you. And that may be one of the only photos that their family's capable to get or to hold on to, because you don't have the camera at home, especially in poor countries where the Jewish community themselves Saloniki Jews were laborers, and most of them were laborers in the docks in Saloniki. They didn't have really the capability of buying a camera for themselves. So their military photos are becomes the only pre-war photo they may have. So these are very valuable to us. But the big question is, what do you do post-war? For example, veterans. When 1990s, we didn't touch the story of the veterans in Yad Vashem, World War II veterans, because it was, as I said, World War II history, nothing to do with the Holocaust. But once 1.2 million Jews from the former Soviet Union, or descendants of Jews from the former Soviet Union, come to Israel, and for them, this is World War II history. And they come to Yad Vashem with their medals, with all their attire, which is involved with World War II. For them, that's the event. That's how they see the Holocaust. They see the Holocaust as a victory, not as the biggest humiliation and mass murder. So do you incorporate that story? And until what moment? Do you collect veteran meetings, or you just keep pictures of them during the war, as we saw earlier on? Why is the Acropolis here? One of my biggest thoughts and challenges is, we say today to Holocaust survivors, when they try to donate the material, we tell them, look, we're not interested too much in what happens post 50s. Let's focus on our theme here. But they tell us, for me, the story ends more or less when I go with my grandchildren to Poland and I show them where I was. That's for me, my personal story. And we learned to say no. But in the 70s, it wasn't that 100%. So we found out in the 70s somewhere, when they start collecting more private material, suddenly we have a lot of material that is not really connected with the Holocaust. But we read the stories and we learned that for this person, this Holocaust survivor from Greece, he's taking his children to Athens. It's the first time they're in Greece post-war. So it's a very significant moment. And it's very important for him not only to capture that image, but to send it to the archives. So back then they received it. Now they're not. But I'm asking myself, 20 years time, probably all the return to Poland, the return to your roots, is going to be probably an historical topic, a theme. Who will store these photos? I'm sure that an historian in 2040 will start asking questions. What did the grandparents do with their grandchildren? Which archive is going to hold that material? I don't know. We probably won't, but is it right? It's an open question mark. Yeah, I don't know yet. And then we reach the more thematic challenges. Now, as an archive, we have an obligation, but the obligations sometimes contradict one another. The classical contradiction of the obligation of the archives is preservation versus presentation, especially with photography. Photography is sensitive. Photography gets damaged very easily. It's enough that you put your family photo in the living room and just went in front of the window, and you'll see a year later how the photo is damaged because of the sun. So how on one hand we allow people to touch the photo if they need it. So we say digitalization, but digitalization is a process. It doesn't happen in one go. And I'm not even dealing with ethical questions here yet. So we have these, for example, these are from these albums that were found in Dachau. And you can see how old that material, because Köln and Kassel, cities in Germany, are written with a C, and German writing laws in 1919 changed general writing from C to K. They started changing the Rechtschreibung, the spelling rules. So this is pre-1919. This material is rare. So on the one hand, if we scan it and show it online, that's great. But look at the album it was found, a steel album that usually has 3 to 4 generations in it. We want, for example, the museum in a future displays wants to show this album. Now, the easy thing today is make a replica. But once you make a replica, you have a problem. Everybody knows it's a replica. You can't deceive the people and say, this is original when it's a lie, when it's obviously not. So this is one of I think the paradox of photo archives, or the conflicting challenges of the photo archives. Then you have the question of gathering the information. We don't know anything about these people. I can tell you that now, as the head of dealing with the online Con Yad Vashem, we actually had the initiative, which that's why we scanned these photos recently, to create some crowdfunding, you could say, of knowledge. We want in Germany to publish these photos without cataloging yet in our archives, and asking the audience in Germany, because many of these people, for example, their names of photos, where it was physically where the photo was taken. We have, for example, soldiers with their units. Perhaps you can identify the units. And in modern photos in the 20s, you already have landscape and already text and scripts. Perhaps this information, by going to the audience, because we don't have that information. We live in Israel. We can't travel there now. We can travel there, but we may not know where to travel to. Perhaps the audience will know. So this is a thought we had recently. You really see here the development also in photography. And then the next challenge, okay, we have the challenge of what happens when you have no information. We need to provide information as much as we can, because it's not just the researcher, the scholar that is looking into that information, it's also the audience. This photo shows you is one example. Again, appears in many archives. We have in Yad Vashem a specific copy of it because we have the collections of Der Stürmer, a scan of all Der Stürmer's collections in our archive, which was given to us. We returned the right to Staatsarchiv Nuremberg because it was originally from there, but we still have a copy. Now, this is a famous photo. One of the problems we had, and that changed in the museum, that photos tend to have a life after they were taken. And for 70 years, 60 years, this is a mixed couple. And then I was doing some research, nothing to do with this photo, and somebody asked me about this photo, and I decided to read more about it. And then we discovered, and then it was a few years back, and there was a research about this photo, and people were identified, and they were not even a couple. She was married to another man. It's kind of rumors that spread on them because she worked for him, for the Jewish person. And then you see the staging. And you can understand, of course, naturally, the signs are humiliation, but it's July 33. It's the early stage of the Nazi regime. It's mob violence. And then you have to update the story. But it's not only a question of updating the story in our collections. We have to inform everybody that used the material, the museum, the website. First of all, that people were identified, and B, that the story we're telling for years, as if it was taken for granted that this is a story, is not the story. I took this image yesterday, the last Jew in Vinica. Apparently, he wasn't the last. No, obviously he wasn't the last, because it's July 41, and the killing of the Jews in Vinica was in September 41. He may not have been Jewish, and it's now not for sure not Vinica but Berdichev. An ARI conference. Somebody wrote an essay about it, and then it was published last year. And we discovered that the whole story of the Holocaust story, and we had again to update not only the museum, we have to update not only the museum, but notice that in Wikipedia, this picture is known as the last Jew in Vinica. There's another problem with this photo. It's not just us holding it. Many archives in the world have this photo. And the person who did the research on this photo found a copy in a diary of an Austrian Wehrmacht soldier in USHMM. So it's not only that it was not given to the archives, it was inside a diary. And then he discovered, reading the text of the diary, where the image was taken. So which one is the original? The original Soviet story it was found on a pocket of of a soldier, which is, I've discovered, quite a common statement. Was it really found on a corpse of a soldier? Perhaps, because we realized that these photos duplicate during the war, and the German soldiers swap these photos with one another, and you have many, many, many sources for the same individual photo. The original is a negative, but there is none. And now, a more challenging issue of identification. This is easy identification. The pictures of these images, they come from a collection from in Zagłębie, just a moment, and in Będzin, a town which was Poland naturally, but annexed during the war to Germany. The story of this collection is a very interesting story, but it was taken in the SS office by a Volksdeutsche, by a German citizen of Poland, who was accused of collaboration. He approaches the Jewish community in Będzin and tells them, look, I have something valuable. I have pictures of all your relatives when you had to report to the ghetto. I'm willing to give it to you if on the condition that you help me with my trial. And the Jewish community is willing to do the deal with him. And he's considered a second-rank collaborator. Then the photos remain in Poland until somebody from Benji manages to reach Poland in the 70s and gets these photos with him. He identifies his brother in the photo, who was killed in Auschwitz later on. When they had to report to the Nazis, it's not just their name and where they lived, but also the professional, Arbeiter, in this case. And we uploaded it all to online because this is a very important way. We have suddenly all of the Benjamin community in front of our eyes. One of the first emails I got a few years back when I began this, my position, was an angry email from a Jewish woman from Mexico. She said, "How dare you write the name Sarah?" Notice that Israel and Sarah appears as a second name in all the backs of the photos. Because it was the area that was annexed to Germany, we were forced to put the second name of Israel and Sarah. And she said, "Don't you realize that this is defamation? And this is abusing the memory of the victims when you add the name that was enforced on them?" And then I'm thinking to myself, just a moment, my grandmother's second name was Sarah. Perhaps Sarah was her second name for some of them too. And in some cases, you see she's called Sarah. Probably Sarah was an added name. Probably for the majority of them is added name. But then again, you don't want to make a mistake here. What do you do? Do you leave the given name, or do you omit it? Moreover, I found out that even the archives itself in Yad Vashem, they were not too sure about it. So one archivist added the names and one archivist omitted the names. And now you have today this disparity between these two different archivists. And because I can see who wrote down each name, because it was done in time where they added it online to our computers, back in the 90s, I see which person did this and which person did that. This leads us to another problem. When you collect archival systems from 1950s to today, you need to realize that there are general archival rules. We, by the way, in their photo archives, don't even follow the archival rules. The photo collections, although it's in the archives, follow Israel's museum laws, which are different in the way we have to preserve them and conserve them and present them. Complicated issue. Then I don't want to give you too much information on the registry itself. But it was created for the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and each time they made ad hoc solutions. That was fine until a computer system came. A cataloging system came where you now do the catalogization online, and the system itself is a stupid computer system. It demands to have kind of a structured system. And then we find the problems appearing. Why are the problems appearing? When I came to the archives, the decision was to do a LIFO, last in, first out. Let's not think about what was done in the past and we didn't fix. Let's just, from now on, make a new regulation. This is our standards, which is probably what the people before me did. But then in 2021, we were told you have 1 year to move the entire collection from the old archival building to the new archival building, which will open hopefully in July this year. And they added, by the way, each and every item has to be barcoded. Now, the idea is that you put a barcode sticker on the envelope where the photos held. But you have to go through each and every single photo, and then connecting the barcodes in an automated way created a problem. We have to correct all the registrations from the past. And then when we started opening this Pandora box, we discovered all the collections that came and were never registered, but because there was too little time and too little staff. Material that was just badly cataloged. And I'll show you a few examples later on. But now continuing with the material, sometimes the identification is done through albums. So a teacher, Yosef Yeshuvi, Hugo Rosenthal before the war, had a school in Herrlingen in Germany. And this was a school for Jewish people who were forced out of the non-Jewish schools. They're assimilated Jewish families, but now under Nazi law, they have to learn in a Jewish school. And this improvised Jewish school, the head teacher, who then survived the war, came to Israel later on. He wrote down the information on pupils. And again, this is just great quality photos with names, and this provides us a lot of information. other sources of name is the back of the photo. This is very important for us. You see these stickers over here. This is a question of preservation. They're not on the photos anymore. When we got this collection, it's from a woman in Israel called that originally her family came from Węgrzów in Poland. And her mother actually came before the war. But when she left, she got pictures from all from townspeople, mostly Jewish, but not only. And they wrote a dedication, farewell, remember us, with a picture of them. Now, she thought she would help us by writing the name on a sticker and then sticking it on the photo itself, which naturally putting a sticker on a photo is deadly for a photo. The chemicals of the glue are terrible for a photo. So our photo conservationists had to really scrape these stickers down. But we still have the stickers next to the photo because you want to preserve the story behind the photo also. You want to know how did it reach us. So we first scanned it and put it online in the way we got it, and then we did the corrections. We could have done it the other way around. We could have returned it to its original conditions and without showing the stickers. Now, the point is, what's funny about the stickers that she wasn't really good in reading 1930s Polish handwriting, and most of them they make no sense, are nonsensical. Lena Zielbenwung, it's actually Wowa, but she wasn't really good in reading this, and she didn't know Polish. So every time there was an O with an apostrophe, she made UNG out of it for some reason. Sometimes we learn a lot about the individuals, for example, because they were certain youth movement uniform, in this case, the Beitar youth movement uniforms, and then it's in Hebrew. Sometimes we identify people by luck. This is we got it, it's 1940 from Vinica, and it's from a dentistry graduation year for people who study dentistry. 80% of the pupils were Jewish. Not only, Komar is not a typical Jewish name, but Korenblit was a Jewish name. It's specifically our staff member, Mati, that happened to be his relative, his grandma's cousin. So it was kind of an interesting moment how accidentally it reaches us, and he discovers it because his family came originally from Vinica. But sometimes these identifications become a cause of problem, and especially when you deal with identifications where you don't have the text on the back of the photo that was done at the time. So for many years, and this is two examples from the Auschwitz album, another photo from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The brothers Sril Israel Jacob and Zelig Jacob are supposed to be the brothers of Lili Jacob, Lili Zamonowitz, the one who discovered the Auschwitz album. A recent publication questions this identification, saying this wasn't the right train. This is not the right time. Can it be that even though the identifications are from 1960 during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, can it be that Lili Jacob already 16 years after, got mixed up with our identifications? One of the biggest problems we have here is multiple identifications. The Auschwitz album alone, we had a problem. More than some people are identified by 4 or 5 different people at the same time, the same person. Now, the person who identifies them is my brother, or the brother, or it's my mother. Who's right and who's wrong? You know, these are black and white photos. Take this specific photo. This is the text we added to this specific photo from the strip. The photo itself is naturally not ours. It belongs to Nara and it's in Warsaw, but we have a copy of it naturally. And this is what we wrote. Numerous people have identified the boy. So what we do today is we don't say this is the person. We say this was identified as X by Y. So on one hand, we want the person to know that we recognize their identification, but we didn't want to take responsibility for the recognition anymore. We don't accept any more of these identifications as a final identification, let alone the one who may not even have survived. Another challenge is, now we go to the new challenges, one of what you do with cataloging approaches. A Boy in the Street is a very bad title, but the collection 3380, the Borovitz collection, is a very old collection. And when they started putting it online, it was impossible to really identify the places. So you give a general statement and hopefully somebody say, I know where it is. In most cases, they don't, but occasionally it happens, by the way. I can tell you that specifically we had someone from Poland who was an expert for uniforms of SS, and he starts correct and sending us more and more emails where he starts correcting the ranks we wrote of German guards and so on. So this is valuable material for us, but it's not very common. The way our archive works is every accession is a collection. The collection can be one photo. A person donated the photo of his grandpa. But a collection may be, as I said, from the Dachau albums, almost 4,000 photos. They're not, we don't divide collections according to certain themes. That means in one collection, we may find various themes. This causes a problem. On one hand, the reason we do it this way is because we want to keep the story intact. Who donated it? When did the pictures arrive into Yad Vashem? And more or less, what's the story behind the donation? But what happens if one donation is a collector's material, where he collects items from throughout Europe, post-war Europe, and he donates it to Yad Vashem, as in the case of the Borovitz collections. So the way to know if it's a collection or not, on the left, you have the collection. That means everything that has 3380 to it, by the way, is connected. It has a connecting story to one another via the collectors. And then this is a serial photo, the number one right of the slash. But notice this error. What is this strange collection? Well, here, just a technical problem, but it can influence everyone. Hebrew, you write from right to left. No, Hebrew, yes, from right to left, and English and Latin and English left to right. And sometimes our typewriters, when you move languages, get mixed up and they just write it in the wrong direction. And this happened in a whole collection of 3028, where the catalog, where the serial number is on the left instead of the right. We have to fix that, but it takes us time to notice that these mistakes happen. And the question is, do we prioritize it? So in the past, we used to say no. But the problem is, we trust very much the fact that the viewer will contact us and tell us, I didn't understand, and we can explain to them the problem. But the viewer may not never contact us. So then we need to think, how do we feed the viewer and make it as simple as possible? Important question. Once we have the collection together, notice what happens. This is our new, which are still improving. This is our problem now. So we have 6 photos from one collection. It's a very easy collection. It's one, they were the lucky ones, the family Appelboim. Again, we wrote in Hebrew and then automatically the English converted it. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, collection of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So very easy collection, 6 photographs from Rafal Wofka. Notice that there's no individual name, as we saw earlier on, to each photo. This is from the stage where we didn't make private collection. In the past, we thought it's a good solution. That allows us to put all those photos online, and we have as many photos as possible. We focus just on uploading. But then we had a problem. These photos tell you nothing if it's just 6 photos from Rafal Wofka. But we have the story. When we collected this material, we wrote down, the person who delivered these photos to us wrote down sometimes the identifications and all the story. And once we don't do the individual catalogization, then these stories disappear. So now we're trying to redo it, but there's a problem. We're 80,000 photos stuck now that aren't written in catalog. The question is, what do you prioritize again? And also here, we began with last in, first out, and then we just got mixed, and we're now doing everything we can. Somebody takes a collection out of a pile, and we start doing it. Unless we discover that it has a very important historical significance to it. Now, the difference between notice the difference of presentation. Again, in the past, when we did a collection, the only way of knowing it's a collection is through the number. Now we can bind in our cataloging system the photos together. So if we did that action, you'll see the whole collection underneath the first photo. If not, you have to gather for yourself. That's great. Now I've explained to you how to look in our collections, but how do you explain to the public? Complicated. And now we reach the interesting story of preservation. I still have 15 more times to talk before I do questions, but lovely story here. The Pavel, what is his first name? I forgot his surname. Marries Annie Tzchori, 3 days before they're sent to Auschwitz from Theresienstadt. They reach Auschwitz. Everything is taken away from Pavel. He still has a wife, the picture of his wife he just married, folds it into 4, hides it behind his teeth, and therefore he manages to go through the sauna without somebody taking the photo of his newlywed wife. And he keeps this photo folded to 4 throughout the war. He re-meets Annie after the war, and he gives her that photo he kept, and then they divorce. He moves to the US, she moves to Israel, but she keeps on having that photo. She donates it in Yad Vashem. When she got the photo, we were looking for extra information, and we discovered that that he gave in 1991 a testimony for Yad Vashem. And he talks about this photo, and he says it was like a mezuzah, the thing the Jews put on the doors, reminding me that there's still hope in the world outside, which is a very interesting story to tell. But there's a problem. The photo is folded to 4, and it's not folded. In photographic words, it's broken, because imagine the photo has a layer of metal on it. So you fold it, you actually break the photo. Here we can see a smaller break. This is also, you can see from the stickers from the collection we had early on, but our photo conservationist actually wrote her master's on this photo, because it's the first time she discovered nail polish painting the photos. From all the photos we got from this family, this photo had nail polish on it. So she decorated it. And how do you preserve a photo with nail polish became her research items. Now, some of these photos, I mean, this is wonderful. This has every single damage a person can do to a specific photo. Pen, burnt, mold, cut, broken, you name it. It's on this specific photo. So now it's a challenge. We had to create a policy of preservation. What photos are preserved first? The answers we made were, first of all, if the photo can do damage to other photos, we have to deal with it. When can a photo do damage to other photos? Mold. Then the photo and mold can infect other photos. We have to kill the mold or dry the mold before it develops. That doesn't concern the importance of the photo itself. But then comes the second prioritization. Auschwitz album, which we have in our collection, is more important than the private collection. So this comes in second categories. And then we had to build up, the whole decision-making process. And I can elaborate it more for those who want an individual discussion. Another challenge is connecting the material. Now, here it was easy for me to connect the material because it's my family. My grandmother came in 1930s from Poland to Jerusalem. My grandfather is 15th generation Jerusalemite, and my father is not even Jewish, he's Welsh. He married my mother in a conference, came here. But Tzalek Bechoni is the cousin of my grandma. He was the head of the Jewish police in the ghetto in Lvovsk. And here's the opening, or the first sentence from that, from his confession. In Polish, the public book was published, is called Confession. In English and in German, they gave an absolutely terrible name. Am I a murderer? Because the first scene and the first description in the book is how he, as a Jewish policeman, is sending his daughter and wife to their deaths in Treblinka. And the family then made a condition in the Hebrew publication that this is not going to be the name. In the Hebrew, it's called The Sad Story of the Documentarist, the sad job of the documentalist. And in 1943-44, he starts writing a diary about his experience in the wartime. The family manages to contact, he died of typhoid during the Warsaw Uprising of 44. He dies of typhoid, typhus, and then he leaves his material with a local lawyer. In 1983, the family, his brother lived in Israel at the time. His brother, the Reshev family, manages to contact that lawyer, and they get the diary, and the diary is published. In 2021, the grandson of the brother contacts me, says, look, I've just been contacted from the Poli Museum in Warsaw. They're asking me if you have anything about Salek left. And actually, I have quite a bit. But before I talk to Poli Museum, does Yad Vashem want it? And I said, look, I work for Yad Vashem. Of course we want it. And it's a celebrity in our standards. And this is the day we collected the material from him. Just unbelievable material. His passport from the 1930s, where he studied in Bordeaux. So every time he was going from Warsaw to Bordeaux and back through Germany, he has a kind of a visa with the swastikas in it on his passport. His will, and also pre-war pictures of Tzadok Pochodnik, and the one on the left, a picture from the ghetto of his wife and daughter who are dying in the first or getting killed in the first page of the diary. Anna and Natalie. First of all, you think about Polish Jews as being very religious, very conservative, and here you can see an upper-class movie theater, cinema owner in Notwotsk in holiday in Italy, and you see this Jewish bourgeoisie that developed in Poland in the 1920s and 30s in film. It's wonderful to see it, and it's, as I said, it's quite rare. But also you see the names of the victims, and if it would be sent to Poland, I'm sure Poland Museum, which are a wonderful museum, and I have only good things to say about them, would probably preserve it quite well. But then what you would lose is that connecting story of how you bind the story together and gave a whole story and not just fragments of a story. Now, it happened to be my relative, and I could identify the story and bring them together, and also in our cataloging system, bring them together. But one of our challenges is, what happens if the family donated something in the 60s and then they donate again in the 90s? And how do we make sure that these things are not only that we discover that they're part of the same family of material, but we also are sure to make it accessible online and put it in our cataloging system. I want to jump a bit because I'm running out of time, but we have interesting material here. But then one thing becomes an even bigger problem. And this is not something I can criticize other institutions when my own institution does it quite often. It's misuse of the photography itself, either presenting the wrong material, which may be my mistake of the archives, or deciding what's important for the viewer. So this is the old Yad Vashem Museum. You can see in the new Yad Vashem post-2005, this was corrected, but they only showed the child, as if that's the only story to tell in the famous photo of the child from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Not the child in the back that's sticking his tongue to the camera. That's not important for the story. The drama is in the child in front. So how do we make sure that museums and users also stay loyal to the historical image? Another example, the original and the more commonly found photo on the left. Then you have the ethical questions, which are in our responsibility. This is a copy of an album we have in our originally from the State Archives in Würzburg, but it's a deportation of the Würzburg Jews. The more you investigate these images, you realize how the photographer himself is doing a very evil act, a humiliating act. Taking the deported Jews from Würzburg and putting them on a wall and then making a profile pictures in an act which is what you usually do to criminals is not the most respectful way to take image of the future victims. On the one hand, this is the most valuable historical material to record deportations. It's very seldom that we have such material. On the same time, it abuses the victims. Do we do a disclaimer saying this was meant to humiliate the victims? By the way, the truth is, even though it seems obvious to me when I see it, this is a development of research in the last 15 years when they started doing research history in photography. I think up to the early 2000s, photography was an annex to historical research. It was, you need an illustration to the book. So you take some photos, and I still get it. We still get requests for usage. And the question is, I'm writing a book about the ghetto in Łódź. Can you provide me with some photos? And ask them what kind of photos and why, and do you want to ask the question who made the photos? And says, no, I just need some visualizations from my article. And then says, okay, so we have a problem here because photos are not just left to be visualizations, they have a story behind them. How do you make sure, or how do you enforce, not enforce by threatening, but how do you try to persuade museums, authors, writers to present the material in an appropriate manner? That's one question. I'm showing it very briefly. what happens when an order crosses a line? You notice there's this photo of the two men, half naked, is from one of the Stroop albums. It's supposed to show you Jews who are physically inferior, ignoring the fact that we're in the ghetto, of course, 1943 and all the stories behind it. When you have a collection of photos from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and images of Stroop, even though that's a very manipulated album and there's a lot to tell about it, you can still decide to censor these photos and present other photos. What do you do when that's the only image? Yesterday, I've been contacted by a journalist. She wants to write a story for the Holocaust National Memorial that we have here in May. She wanted to make it an item. And we were discussing, she was discussing about film. And in the end, she said she wanted to do something about the Liepaja film, of the executions in Liepaja. And then as we were talking and saying, where's your, when we talked about ethical images, and I told her, look, censorship is bad. We don't want to censor photos. However, we have photos in the Yad Vashem collection of gang rape, of mutilated bodies, of violence, obscene violence. We usually tend to think that the Holocaust is very kind of clean, gas chambers, execution. But then you see the gory details of the Holocaust, especially from places like Jasenovac or Transnistria, where you see, but not only. I mean, the one from the body parts is from Stutthof, and the gang rape is from France. And really, soldiers priding themselves in the most hideous forms. We decided not to put it online. And then I told the journalist, if it's a singular photo, because she thought that also the Liepaja executions are kind of degrading for the victims, saying, look, you have to create an image, a limit. This is the only, no, it's not the only, but the only good quality film of executions in the East we have. If we censor that, we're censoring history. If we censor the rape of the gang rape of a woman, we're not changing the historical knowledge. We're not preventing the truth of history coming out. We're just saying this is disrespectful for the victims. But that's not a real. I'd say there's no real guidelines here. Recently in the museum, there was a decision. There was a huge discussion. What do you do with the executions from Liepaja of the women, those that were found later on, December 1941, the executions of the woman in the beach of Schkede, found by a Jewish person who was hidden by Robert Sedos, by Righteous Amongst the Nations, and you have the naked woman before they're being shot. It's in the museum. And there was recently more and more questions, not from religious audience, but actually from women's organizations. Why are we showing these photos? It's disrespectful for the women that they're undressed and presented to the public here. And then we said, the people who were claiming for the presentation of the photo were saying, this is history. 20 years ago, Yad Vashem was headed by Holocaust survivors. And one of them, who was himself a Holocaust survivor, a religious Holocaust survivor, said, you have to show these photos because this is historical proof. And then 20 years later, it's actually the second generation that is becoming more and more sensitive. And it reminds me that in the photo collection of Yad Vashem, up to the 60s, what we have is atrocity photos. And only then the nature of the photos begin to change. It seems almost that the closer you are to an event, your readiness to show you the hard photos is more common than when you think about it 40, 50 years after. Then people start developing the sensitivity. And I'm saying actually this is a victory for the Holocaust memory, because you don't need the most repulsive photos to prove that it happened. The Holocaust is stable enough in its memory to kind of not censor it, but to be more sensitive to the victim's respect. But we do want to know people to know that it's there. But again, this photo, censor it from museums, yes. Do we censor it from our online exhibition, online display, on our catalog, like we did with the rape photos? So there's no solution yet. One of the options was to do a disclaimer. That means to blur the photo and says, you're going to see a photo that is sensitive, so and so. Naturally, that invites people to see it, but at least you have this disclaimer. But I don't think it's something that we will know for sure how to solve. Reaching the last question is the future problems. AI, the wonderful new magic 2 letters. Yeah. Last year we got this wonderful album of terrible but wonderful for historical evidence album of the Reichspogromnacht or the Kristallnacht from Nuremberg and Fürth. The story, an American soldier was stationed in Nuremberg. He was an intelligence officer. He goes back to America, and it's in the family possessions before they donate it to Yad Vashem. That's a long story short. It's a very long story short. And when we got it back in September 2022, we were so excited to see the Reichspogromnacht, but from close intimacy, not just the burning synagogue, but you can see the people coming with the canisters and burning it down, and also the frightened faces. You realize that it was a pogrom, because not just burning of synagogues, not just Kristall, but beating people, waking them at night, lynching them, and all the brutal details that were usually kept to the descriptions, either in the Wiener Library in London or in our early collections from 33, the Balkaduri collection, which collected evidence of German Jewry, which describe this violence, but not an image. So at the same time, a person from a website called Numbers to Names said, let's try and identify the people. And I said, let's do it. Let's identify the people, show us what the AI can do. And he receives a report. And in the report, the album, by the way, is a private album that goes not only in Nuremberg, but describes the whole experience he had in France and Germany at the time, and including pictures of this person. And the AI recognized it's Charles de Gaulle. Brilliant, as if I didn't know that's Charles de Gaulle. Yeah, I needed AI to discover this. But then, one of the photos in the album, it matched a photo in the album, an identical photo in the USHMM called "A Jewish Youth is Aired by SA Members" in the synagogue in Nuremberg. I looked into the collections in USHMM, and the same story. It was an American soldier, but a different one, bringing to America exactly the same photo from exactly the same place, from Nuremberg. Does it mean that these photos they're not from one source, because we have two different developers in the back. You can see this one and from Nuremberg and the one from Fruit, but both have the dates 10th of November 38. So it's really, but it means that at least some of the photos were multiplied at the time. They were developed a few times. And then we find out, and this is something that AI discovered. We would never discover it if it wasn't for the abilities to match these photos together in a computerized machine. But then we became suspicious. It says it identified one of the women here in the album with this person, Bianca Zinger. The photo came with a page of testimony from our early collection. The person who identified, who had the machine, said, let's contact her son, the one who gave the page of testimony. We discovered his mother. And I'm telling him, yeah, but in page of testimony, she comes from somewhere in Schlesien, in Germany, but in a different place from Nuremberg. And then he said, well, it's written that they were merchants. Perhaps they were traveling. I'm saying, perhaps. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I can't commit to such an identification if there's obviously a problem here. And then I contacted the Israeli services responsible for doing passports, because they have the most developed facial recognitions machinery that is in the market. That's their job in creating the best. And they said, yeah, Yad Vashem is a very respected organization in Israel. Let's help you out. Let's look for it. And they have 3 systems, and one said, yes, perhaps, and 2 said, no, it's not the same face. So it just shows you that even in the most complicated systems in the world, most developed AI, this idea of automatic facial recognition won't necessarily work. It works when you have a person like de Gaulle. Okay, there's so many images of de Gaulle that it's easy for the machine, and in the end, that's how the AI works. It doesn't create knowledge, it manifests knowledge. So once you have many photos of one person, it will identify it, but it becomes more tricky in such conditions. And sometimes the good old system of asking people who may know, and I would recommend every archivist to go to as many conferences as possible, even if they don't give a lecture. I went to a conference in Paris, and one of the professors, there was a professor for photography of Germany. He wrote about the Würzburg album, which I showed you earlier on, and I contacted him, Jonathan Satlin from Boston, and says, look, I have this material from Germany. And then he writes me an email that he wants to use these photos for a lecture. And in doing so, I've discovered quite a bit about the synagogue in Fürth, including identifying the man who's clearly afraid being Rabbi Dr. Siegfried Behrens. He made his investigation. He was able to match this information together in old primitive knowledge, information knowledge, and not artificial knowledge. So there's a lot of value in also connecting. You know, one of the challenges we have as photo archivists is always being in touch with the world of research that discovers new things. ERI, by the way, is a place where we do a lot of that knowledge. As I said, the story about the last student Vinica comes through ERI, our ERI networks. This comes specifically by another conference. So I do recommend all archivists to be updated online. It's impossible for us to read all day long new articles, but it's easier perhaps to go to a conference and present some of the questions and, you know, establish contacts. Coloring is also a new question. This is a coloring. We got this image. Somebody wanted to donate this photo, and it was actually our photo the one who conservationist and the one who that are in from our laboratory says, just a moment, these colors aren't original. This color didn't exist in 1946. It was the bunker of Miła 17th Street in Warsaw, the first Warsaw Ghetto Uprising bunker memorial. Macabre as it seems, and it's colored. We didn't know that. It was only somebody who was really an expert in photography could tell us that. And then you have the Photoshop. This is a primitive Photoshop, but it's obvious from this Russian album that the Star of David on the Polish boy was missing, so they added a Star of David, even though the Jews of Warsaw didn't have a yellow Star of David on their clothes. But more troubling are these photos, like the one bottom right, or the one here, which I and a member of our staff managed to do in Mid-Journey bots. When you come closer, you can see that the quality of the photo on the right, the faces are still bad, dodgy, but imagine that in just a matter of time until the photo on the right would look very much similar like the photo on the left, which is in original. One of the future challenges in another example, which is also less successful. But this is something we did. We didn't ask for a professional AI Mid-Journey bot expert to do it. We did it as a game. And we have a challenge in a few years' time. How do we make sure that, first of all, the material we get is original? And then how do we ensure the public, we give them a certificate, what we have is original form? In the world of fakes, somebody has to guarantee the authenticity of a photo. And the archives have to be more and more aware of these manipulations in the past. We cannot just say, oh, it was colored. We have to say when it was colored, who colored it, why is it colored, and what are the possibilities that it may not be authentic. Holocaust deniers are waiting behind the street corner to catch us with these mistakes. So we have to prepare for that. That was a long talk in a very short time, but I'm here for another 10 minutes of questions. Thank you. Okay, I have here an audience that Cornelia and Mindy who work in Yad Vashem, thank you, but it's kind of a home turf here for me. So thank you, by the way, for your nice words.
And before we do questions, I'm just gonna, before people leave, I'm just putting a quick poll out. If everyone could just quickly answer it. And then feel free to answer it, and Jonathan, you can take questions.
Yeah.
And thank you very much. Thank you. That was very interesting in content, and also the challenges that really archivists are going to face in the future and are facing.
I was asked, what database system do you have? Since I don't see anyone from our information technology department at Vashem, I would say we have a system called IDEA ALM, and it's terrible. Ex Libris is the most popular now in Israel, but we don't have it. Sorry, information technology, if you're here. But IDEA ALM, it's not too bad, but it's meant for libraries and not for archives, and that's a problem. Yeah. Any other questions? I think you're all filling the forms. That's why it's. Some of you are men and can't do two things together. It's okay. I'm also incapable of drinking coffee and speaking.
We'll keep everything open for another few minutes, and if anyone has questions, they can stay. And I'd like to remind everyone that there's still another one-on-one clinic available with Jonathan, and you can be in touch with me through my email. And if you don't have any questions, I'll keep the poll open, and otherwise, Jonathan will stay around for another 5 minutes in case there are questions. And thank you, everybody. I think that was a really interesting lecture. And as I mentioned, you'll all have a follow-up email with the recording.
אפשר בקרם חתומה? בכל בבקשה להעביר את כרטיס בקורא, ביציאה. לרמה. if I have 5 minutes, I think one advice for archivists, which I think is important, because my next lecture, which I have to do in 5 minutes, is for a genealogy course that Yad Vashem does. And I couldn't be late, and I can't be late, but I'm not so worried because the one responsible for the course is in this lecture too. Seema, I saw you. But we always have to think about who are the audience. To say the audience are researchers who can find the information for themselves is great, but that's not most of the audience. Definitely not for a major institution like Yad Vashem, but even not if it could be a 13-year-old child that is doing kind of a trip work about his family for school. It could be a genealogist who's looking to find out more and more. And we need to provide at least that basic information that may not present it online, but allow him to have the accessibility also to ask the right questions so we can help him. Sometimes archivists have a tendency to think too much about what's easy for them to catalog, to make order in the system. And I can understand that because you have to make organize a system of sometimes millions, thousands of documents. But we always have to be aware that we also provide service, and we need to put ourselves in the mind of a person who's historically or archivically uneducated 15, 18-year-old high school who's doing work for school. And then how do we make sure that he understands the information? Not all of it, because it's the research has to be done. How do we provide him the precise information, the correct one, as much as we have to our knowledge and the information we've collected? And how do we make sure that he's able to contact us, or she, and say, there's something I want to know about this interconnection. If you're not able to provide this basic service, we're not really doing our commitment to society, if you ask me. Yeah. That's my personal notes to finish. Yeah.
Jonathan, you had a question. Do we collect Holocaust denial documents?
Our library does. Our library has the biggest collection of Holocaust denial material in the world. So if you want to know more about Holocaust denial, come to our library. We don't collect it so much in the archives because our archives don't deal with this topic. But our research library does. So naturally, you'll see a lot of that. And if people are interested in the topic, they'll find it in our collection. Thank you. Mulțumesc, Anna, for your help offering help in identification for Romania. My email is the same as Haley's, but instead of writing Haley Dillman, write jonathan.matthews@yadvashem.org. We all have the same. The database we use is IDEA ALM. Are we happy with it? Here I have my reservations. Yeah. If you want to connect to get it corrected, it's very simple. Just names that you want to correct, just contact our archival staff and you'll be able to connect to find the names. And they will correct the spelling. That's very simple. Right.
Any other questions? Jonathan has to go. So any other questions? He just gave his email, but if you want to have that session, email me. And I will set up the session for you. So I'm happy for you have my email written down, so I'm happy for any direct contact afterwards. And if anyone else has their archive feels like through the expert lab of ARI feels like they need any other help, they can be in touch with me, and we can see how our expert lab can help you. So thank you, everybody. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everybody else.
Thank you. And you can still contact me, of course. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan, from Argentina.
Thank you so much.